In this episode, we move from the idea of having an incident response plan on paper to the harder question of what makes that plan actually work when something goes wrong. Brand new learners often picture response as a fast technical scramble where the most important thing is simply detecting the issue and acting quickly. Speed does matter, but response often breaks down not because people lack urgency, but because they do not know how to handle the information they are suddenly collecting, sharing, and protecting. The moment an incident begins, teams start dealing with logs, user records, system details, business data, communications, and possible evidence, and each of those may carry different levels of sensitivity and risk. That is why incident response, IR, is tied so closely to data handling policy decisions. A response plan becomes much more real and much more useful when people already know what data they can access, what must be protected, what may be shared, and what must be preserved carefully under pressure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An IR plan is often described as the organization's guide for preparing for, detecting, responding to, and recovering from security incidents. That is true, but for beginners it helps to understand that a plan is not just a list of steps. It is also a set of decisions about authority, communication, evidence, priorities, and risk. During a real incident, responders do not work in an empty space. They work inside a business that has customers, employees, systems, legal duties, privacy concerns, and operational pressures. As soon as investigators begin examining the event, they start touching data that may be confidential, regulated, highly sensitive, or essential to the business. If the plan only says investigate, contain, and recover, but says little about how that data should be treated, teams may move quickly in the wrong direction. In practice, implementing a plan means making sure the response can happen in a controlled way, and that control depends heavily on clear data handling rules. A data handling policy is the set of rules and expectations that tells people how information should be classified, stored, accessed, shared, retained, and eventually disposed of. Outside an incident, that may sound like a quiet governance topic, but during an incident it becomes operational very fast. Responders may need to collect server records, account details, messages between employees, customer data, system snapshots, or security alerts. Some of that information may reveal how the organization works internally. Some may expose weaknesses. Some may include private personal information or business secrets. Without a policy, people are forced to improvise at the exact moment when mistakes become easiest to make and most costly to fix. With a policy, the organization has already decided basic questions such as where incident data belongs, who can see it, how it should be labeled, and how far it can travel. Those decisions do not slow response down. In most cases, they prevent chaos and make response faster. Pressure is one of the biggest reasons these policy decisions matter so much. When an incident feels urgent, people naturally want to gather everything, share everything, and move information as fast as possible. That instinct is understandable, but it can create new risk while the team is trying to solve the original one. An employee may forward sensitive logs to the wrong group for help. A responder may copy case data into an unapproved workspace. A manager may request details that are not necessary for their role, simply because the event sounds serious. Someone may preserve evidence poorly, overwrite useful records, or mix working notes with material that should have tighter control. None of those mistakes require bad intent. They usually come from uncertainty mixed with urgency. Data handling policy gives people boundaries before the pressure arrives. It helps them know which actions are safe, which approvals are required, and which shortcuts create more harm than they save. One of the most important policy decisions during IR involves classification, because not all data deserves the same treatment. Some information is routine internal material. Some is highly sensitive. Some may include personally identifiable information, PII, customer records, financial details, intellectual property, or privileged communications that require special care. If responders do not know what category of data they are dealing with, they may store it in the wrong place, share it too broadly, or overlook notification duties tied to exposure. A mature response plan does not wait until the middle of an incident to ask whether the affected material is sensitive. It builds likely data categories into response thinking ahead of time. That way, when an event affects a payroll system, a customer portal, or a human resources repository, the team already understands that certain rules apply. Classification decisions help determine who may participate, how information is labeled, what extra protections are needed, and how seriously potential exposure must be treated. Access control is another central part of implementing response through policy. During an incident, many people may want visibility, but not everyone needs the same level of detail. Executives may need status and impact information. Technical responders may need raw evidence. Legal or compliance staff may need certain facts, but not every investigative note. Business leaders may need to understand operational disruption without seeing personal details that do not affect their decisions. If access is granted too broadly, the organization can create internal exposure while trying to manage an external or technical problem. If access is too narrow without planning, critical work may stall because the right people cannot get what they need in time. Data handling policy helps strike that balance by defining need-to-know expectations, approval paths, and temporary access practices. A good IR plan works best when it assumes collaboration will be necessary, but still protects the idea that incident data should only be available to those whose role truly requires it. Collection and preservation are also deeply tied to policy, because an incident quickly becomes much harder to understand when the evidence is incomplete, altered, or poorly managed. Beginners sometimes think evidence handling only matters in major criminal investigations, but it matters in ordinary organizational response too. If a team collects the wrong material, loses track of where it came from, or changes it accidentally during review, the facts of the incident can become harder to trust. Policy decisions help reduce that problem by defining how incident data should be gathered, where original material should be kept, how working copies should be separated from preserved copies, and what documentation should accompany collection. These choices support both accuracy and accountability. They also make it easier to explain later what the team saw, how it reached its conclusions, and whether the response followed an organized process. When evidence handling is treated casually, both technical confidence and organizational trust begin to weaken. Internal communication is another area where data handling policy turns a plan into practical action. During a live event, people need updates quickly, but that does not mean every audience should receive the same information in the same format. A technical team may need detailed findings, affected systems, and hypotheses about what is happening. Senior leaders may need a concise picture of impact, decisions, and risk to operations. Human resources, legal, or communications teams may need specific facts that affect their responsibilities. If one raw investigation thread is shared with everyone, the result can be confusion, oversharing, and accidental exposure of sensitive details that were never needed outside the core response team. Strong policy helps an organization separate investigative material from executive updates, operational notes from broader communications, and sensitive specifics from higher-level summaries. That makes communication clearer and safer. It also helps prevent the common mistake of confusing transparency with unrestricted distribution. External sharing raises even more difficult decisions, which is why it should be addressed by policy before an incident occurs. Depending on the situation, an organization may need to communicate with outside counsel, cyber insurance providers, service providers, regulators, customers, law enforcement, partners, or the public. Each of those audiences creates a different balance between disclosure, obligation, timing, and risk. Share too little, and the organization may fail to meet legal, contractual, or ethical duties. Share too much, and it may expose sensitive internal weaknesses, personal information, or investigative details that should have remained limited. Data handling policy helps determine what types of information may leave the organization, who must approve that sharing, and what controls apply to the transfer. A response plan becomes far easier to implement when those decisions are not made from scratch in the middle of confusion. Policy gives shape to the conversation so the organization can act deliberately instead of reacting through fear, haste, or public pressure. Containment decisions also depend on data handling thinking, even though beginners sometimes assume containment is purely technical. Containment is about limiting harm, but harm often involves data exposure, misuse, corruption, or loss of control. If a system may be compromised, responders must think not only about shutting access down, but also about what information is on that system, what may already have moved, and what must be preserved before major changes are made. In some cases, isolating a system too quickly may interrupt business processes that protect or track sensitive information. In other cases, waiting too long may allow further leakage. These are not just engineering choices. They are policy-informed decisions about what data matters most, what risk is acceptable in the short term, and what protections cannot be compromised even during a crisis. A strong IR plan helps responders act with urgency, but data handling policy helps them understand the consequences of those actions on confidentiality, integrity, availability, and future investigation. Modern environments make these questions even more important because incident data is no longer confined to one office, one server room, or one device. Information may live in cloud platforms, collaboration tools, employee laptops, software services, backups, and shared dashboards across many teams and locations. That means incident response often involves data moving across organizational boundaries, vendor relationships, and multiple layers of responsibility. A responder may need records from a third-party service, cloud activity summaries, or user data stored in places the organization does not fully control in the traditional sense. Without clear policy, people may make inconsistent choices about exports, temporary storage, cross-team sharing, and which workspaces are approved for sensitive investigation material. That creates confusion at exactly the wrong moment. Implementing an IR plan in a modern environment, therefore, depends on already knowing what storage locations, communication paths, collaboration spaces, and access approvals are acceptable when sensitive incident data must be gathered and reviewed quickly. Documentation is another place where policy and response meet in a very practical way. During an incident, teams make many decisions about what they collected, who reviewed it, what was shared, what was withheld, and why certain actions were approved. If none of that is documented clearly, the organization may struggle later to explain its reasoning, defend its choices, or learn from the event. Data handling policy helps define what records of the response itself should be kept, how long those records should remain available, and who is allowed to review them after the incident is over. This matters for accountability, but it also matters for improvement. After the urgent phase has passed, leaders and responders need to examine whether the right data was available, whether it was protected properly, and whether any unnecessary exposure happened during the response. Those lessons are much easier to capture when the organization treated incident documentation as controlled, meaningful information rather than scattered notes created under stress. A common beginner misconception is that policy exists mainly to slow people down or satisfy legal concerns after the real work is finished. In reality, well-designed policy often makes incident response smoother because it removes uncertainty from decisions that would otherwise waste time. Another misconception is that only very large organizations need formal data handling rules for incidents. Smaller organizations may have fewer systems and fewer staff, but they still face the same basic questions about sensitive data, evidence, communication, and trust. A third misconception is that technical skill alone is enough. Technical skill is essential, but even a highly capable team can create new problems if it mishandles employee records, customer information, confidential business material, or response evidence. What makes an IR plan effective is not only the ability to find and fix technical issues. It is also the ability to manage information responsibly while those issues are being investigated and resolved. This is why exercises, reviews, and planning conversations should include data handling decisions instead of treating them as a separate administrative topic. If a team practices only the technical side of response, it may still be unprepared for the real-world choices that shape a live incident. People need to know where sensitive case data goes, what kinds of summaries different audiences receive, which approvals matter before sharing outside the response team, and what material must be preserved carefully. These choices should feel familiar before a crisis begins. Over time, Strong organizations refine both the IR plan and the supporting data handling policy together, because each one strengthens the other. The plan describes how to respond, while the policy defines how information should move, be protected, and remain under control during that response. When those two pieces are aligned, teams are much more likely to act quickly without becoming careless, and much more likely to stay organized when events become stressful. As we close, the main lesson is that incident response plans do not become real only when people know what technical steps to take. They become real when people know how to handle the information that flows through every part of the response. Data handling policy decisions determine what can be accessed, how evidence is preserved, who may see sensitive material, what can be shared internally or externally, and how the organization protects trust while it works through uncertainty. For a beginner, this is an important shift in perspective because it shows that response is not just about fixing systems. It is also about governing information under pressure so that the organization solves the original problem without creating new ones. When policy and planning work together, IR becomes more disciplined, more defensible, and much more effective. That is how a response plan moves from paper into practice and becomes something the organization can actually rely on when the moment of stress arrives.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.